Parliamentarians never before has so much depended on your ability to deliver results for Canada. That is what people expect and need from you. In relation to ending this pandemic, their priorities for this 44th Parliament are clear. A more resilient economy and a cleaner and healthier future for all of our kids.
That's Governor General Mary Simon reading the throne speech for the first time for her, laying out the government's promises and priorities. So what was the overarching message out of that speech? Does any of it signal a willingness for the parties to work together? It's Tuesday. Doesn't matter. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see everyone. Okay, let's just start with your expectations of the throne speech. Mine are always kind of low because it's an overarching message. But Althea, did the government succeed in delivering what that message was, and your thoughts on what you think it was?
Well, I too didn't really have any expectations for the throne speech. Frankly, we just had an election campaign. It would have been bizarre if the throne speech did not match that platform. The throne speech from last year, it was only just a year ago that they prorogued, very similar to the throne speech we heard today. Some of the similar themes that we heard 2 years ago, frankly, in the 2019 throne speech. What that they need to do? Well, what I expected them to do, which was not in the throne speech, probably more interesting, is any olive branch for the opposition parties. There was nothing specifically that the NDP could latch onto, and that's probably why NDP leader Jagmeet Singh reacted the way he did. There were a few overtures, actually, to the Conservatives, but they wanted none of it. And there was nothing specifically for the Bloc, but there was also nothing that the Bloc could really oppose. Mm-hmm. So in the end, I would say it was kind of like a no surprise throne speech, mm-hmm. an inoffensive throne speech, and therefore one that will carry the day and see them live until next week. Yeah, or in 2 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, and certainly the Bloc says, yeah, it's not great, but we'll vote for it. There's no reason why we would vote against it. Chantal, your thoughts?
I'll start with an aside. In one part of the country, people were watching to see how the Governor General's French would play out. Mm-hmm. In other parts of the country, it was a historic moment to hear Inuktitut spoken in a throne speech in the House of Commons. So on the French, yes, it's work in progress, but I found that Mary Simon was very brave to have as much French in the throne speech and to take it on. So I'll give her points for courage. The throne speech overall, it's the third in 3 years. It's happened before, 3 throne speeches from the same party in 3 years, but you could not have expected any surprises. But I find that if you go back to 2015, you'd probably find that with every throne speech, it becomes less sunny because the circumstances are becoming more difficult.
Yeah, and that is true. We've seen that crises have gotten in the way of the government's vision. Andrew, your thoughts on what you heard today?
Rosie, I think the line that stood out for me, I want to read it because I want to make sure I get it right. We will always stand up for a brighter future for all. Most throne speeches are full of bromides and not a lot of substance, but there's usually a hint here, a code word there, some indication of something new, something bubbling under. This is probably the emptiest throne speech I can recall. It's remarkable. They said that they call it the building a resilient economy, and there's so little in this about the economy. You can look through this and there's not a mention of growth, there's not a mention of productivity, there's not a mention, needless to say, of deficits or debt or taxes. This is a kind of an inflection moment in the economy. We have a very different economy now than we've had for the last 20 or 30 years, with inflation now bubbling up to 5% or so. That's not necessarily the government's fault, but it's certainly the problem the government has to deal with and has to be responsible for, because we don't want to see inflation get embedded in people's expectations and start to become very difficult to get back out of the system. And beyond that, we have this continuing problem of really slow growth in this economy when we need to have much faster growth if we're going to pay for our social programs. These are huge problems, and the economy in general just doesn't seem to rate as a real priority for this government. What you saw more of in this was the odd thing to kind of troll the Conservatives, conversion therapy or I forget the other two, but this is, I didn't think it really lived up to the moment. I know we've had 3 throne speeches in the last 3 years, but after, the most important election since 1945, as we were told, I would have thought they'd have a little more mind than this.
To be fair, they did point to daycare as a way to get the economy to grow. That's the only line that I remember around growth. Yeah.
They took a bunch of things they were going to do anyway. There were policies that of general application, and then said, "Oh, and this is also good for the economy."
Okay, Chantal, Chantal, yes.
But it is only a throne speech,
Right.
and most of them are not memorable. It is also a throne speech delivered on November 23, so low expectations of anything big happening between now and Christmas.
Sure.
I think they're keeping their powder dry on the economy for the budget. Yeah. And I happen to feel it's probably a good bet if you're a minority government, the real hard bargaining is not going to be happening over the throne speech. Yeah. It's basically a repeat of what you've already said. So I'm not particularly worried that it wasn't a budget speech.
Okay, but to Andrew's point, and because we are at a sort of a pivot moment for lots of reasons in the country, and that did allow Erin O'Toole to go hard at the Liberals around inflation and some of the things that he thought should have been in the speech. Here's what he said.
The reality facing Canadian families seems to be something that the Liberal government are all too happy to blissfully ignore. The Liberal government's spending is fueling the inflation crisis. The government's ideology is fueling division, and this government's platitudes are becoming barriers to real action.
So we could have a long conversation about what is actually fueling inflation beyond just the government spending, but the political strategy behind that argument. Althea, I'll start with you on this. It's interesting because it is something people are talking about around in their kitchens. The cost of gas, the cost of food, all that kind of stuff.
The cost of housing, yes, affordability is a huge issue. Inflation is a big issue. You see it every time you go to the grocery store. And the challenge for the Conservatives is to tie that to the Liberals, to make it not a supply chain issue, not a global issue that our allies are also experiencing, but one that you blame squarely on the government. And you saw that this morning, not just with Erin O'Toole, but with Pierre Poilievre, the finance critic, going out and calling this now a Liberal inflation tax. But the question becomes, when you ask them, well, how would you address it?
Yes.
Then the Conservatives start talking about vague things like, well, we would cut some supports. Well, which one? Well, there's no specificity on that because they don't want to annoy anybody. So that is a challenge for them. I think one of the things that brought home to me why the Liberal Party has been so successful in our history was, and part of Erin O'Toole's comments after the speech was, he came out and he said that, the Liberal government was not doing enough to support oil and gas development in this country. Well, he just spoken after the Bloc leader came out and said, well, the Liberal government was not doing enough to cap oil and gas development in this country. I mean, this perfect Goldilocks position explains why the Liberals get elected over and over and over again.
Okay, Andrew, you brought up inflation there. What do you make of the way the Conservatives and Erin O'Toole are using it here?
Well, I agree with Althea that it's a simplistic analysis simply to say, oh, it's the government's fault. Inflation is up around the world. But it's also the government's problem that going forward, they have to make sure that inflation doesn't stay with us. I think that's also a political priority. Inflation, people don't like inflation, but economically, it's the surest way to wreck an economy. So they've got to come to grips with it. And I agree with Chantal that, a throne speech is not a budget, but even in its budgets, this government really doesn't place a lot of focus on economic growth, on the long-term economic prospects of the country. And this is a severe challenge for us with an aging population. And they seem to be much more focused, and we saw some references to it in the throne speech here, on redistributing amongst the various groups in society rather than trying to grow the pie for everybody.
Chantal.
If I had $1 for every time a throne speech did not actually live up to what ended up being the government priorities, I would probably be rich at this point.
Well, you might not be here.
Oh, I'd be living, I don't know, in some tax haven, including, the throne speech from 2019 after the last election, which actually. Makes for interesting read because the pandemic was not in the picture.
Yeah.
I don't think the Liberals really care about anything that the Conservatives are saying at this point. I'm not saying that that will last forever, but I think it's a safe bet that between now and the budget, they are happy enough to let Erin O'Toole and others try to reframe the question around inflation. The budget will be another proposition. I think everyone knows that.
Yeah. And inflation may not be the same concern by the time the budget comes around. Yeah. Sorry, Althea, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, or the fiscal update, which could come in December if they decide to go through with what we're hearing.
Yeah.
Fiscal update just before Christmas? Yeah, right. Lots of people will be paying a lot of attention.
I got to leave it there, everybody, but you'll be back on Thursday. Thank you for being here earlier and again tonight, Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. And with that, I'll send it back to Adrienne and Andrew in Toronto.